The Pale Guest. Saiko moved into the old machiya in Kanazawa on a cold, gray afternoon. The house had been cheaper than any other place she'd seen, and since she had left Tokyo in a hurry, she wasn't in a position to be picky. The previous tenant had left suddenly, according to the landlord, but Saiko didn't ask questions. She told herself the quiet neighborhood, with its narrow streets and slow pace, was exactly what she needed to sort her life out. On her first night, the house felt off. The air was heavier than she expected, carrying an earthy, damp smell like a forest after rain. The creaks and groans of the old wooden floors echoed as she walked, louder than they should have been. But she told herself it was normal. Old houses make noise, empty houses feel eerie. She was overthinking it. Her first few nights passed without much incident. She filled her time unpacking, folding clothes, and scrolling endlessly on her phone. But there was one thing she couldn't explain. Every night, just after midnight, she woke up suddenly, her heart pounding. Her eyes would dart toward the door. It wasn't open, but it felt open. It was as though something on the other side was looking at her. Each night, she stayed frozen in bed until sleep finally took her. A week later, something changed. She came home late from work, exhausted and ready to collapse. The first thing she noticed was the front door. It was unlocked. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the handle. Did I forget to lock it? She wondered. Her thumb pressed the latch, and the door swung open slowly. Inside, the air was still. Too still. She stepped inside, closed the door, and clicked the lock. She leaned down to remove her shoes, then froze. There were footprints. Muddy, bare footprints tracked across the wooden floor, leading from the door and disappearing into the hallway. Her stomach dropped. She clutched her phone and slowly followed the trail, each step more hesitant than the last. Her breathing was shallow, her ears straining for any sound. The footprints ended at the entrance to the living room. The sliding door to the garden was wide open. Her heart pounded in her chest. Did someone come in? Did someone leave? She stepped outside and scanned the overgrown garden. The weeds swayed in the breeze. Her eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for movement, but nothing moved. Her fingers trembled as she shut the sliding door and locked it, triple checking it this time. She barely slept that night. The following nights were worse. She woke every night at 3:15 a.m., always 3:15. She didn't need to check the clock. She knew it was that time. Every single night. Her body would jolt awake, breath shallow, heart thudding in her chest. The darkness in the room was too thick, the silence too loud. She felt it again, the presence on the other side of the floor. Not moving, just there. She tried ignoring it. She tried convincing herself it was nothing, but she knew it wasn't. On the sixth night, she woke to a noise, a soft scratching sound. Her eyes snapped open. It was faint, but it was inside the room. Her body went rigid. She gripped the blanket and slowly tilted her head toward the wall beside her bed. The sound was coming from there. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Her breath was shaky. Is it an animal? A rat? She didn't move, didn't breathe. The scratching stopped. Then something tapped on the wall. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Her chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. She lay there, her face half buried in the pillow, eyes fixed on the wall. She bit her tongue to keep from screaming. It's just a house noise. It's just the house settling. The tapping started again. Faster now, like something trying to get in. Tap, 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 tap. She bolted from the room and spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen with every light in the house on. The next day she called the landlord. The woman was polite but dismissive. It's an old house, dear, she said. The walls creak, the floors shift. You're just not used to it. I saw footprints, Saiko said, her voice cracking. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You must have tracked them in yourself. I didn't, Saiko whispered. The landlord's tone changed, colder now. If you're unhappy, you can always move out. Saiko hung up, furious. She wasn't imagining it. Later that week, she found it. While cleaning the living room, she noticed one of the wall panels was loose. It was subtle, but once she spotted it, she couldn't unsee it. With a cautious hand, she pried it open. Inside was a hidden compartment. Dust poured out, and the sharp, pungent smell of earth and decay filled her nose. Her heart raced as she reached it. Her fingers brushed against something rough. She pulled it out slowly. It was an old sketchbook. The cover was leather, cracked with age. She opened it. The first page was a charcoal drawing of a woman. Her face was twisted in fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. Her eyes were wide, hollow, like she was looking directly at Psycho. Psycho flipped to the next page. A child, curled into a ball with his face buried in his knees. But something was wrong with his hands. His fingers were too long. Her breathing quickened. She flipped faster. Each drawing was worse than the last. Faces contorted in fear, bodies twisted into unnatural poses. She reached the final page. It was half finished. The figure's body was drawn, but the head was still just a sketch outline. Unfinished. She slammed the sketchbook shut and shoved it back into the wall. Her hands were shaking too badly to close the panel properly. That night, she didn't sleep. At 3:15 a.m., Psycho woke to the sound of breathing. It wasn't hers. Her body froze. The breath was slow and shallow just behind her. It wasn't moving. It wasn't going away. Don't turn around, her mind screamed. Don't turn around, don't turn around. Then it spoke. Do you see me? Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes welled with tears, her heart pounding in her ears. She clenched the blanket, praying she could make herself smaller. Look at me, it said. The voice wasn't angry. It was gentle, calm. That's what made it worse. She didn't turn around. The sound of footsteps filled the room, soft, slow steps circling her bed. Her mind was screaming, don't look, don't look, don't look. Her phone vibrated on the floor. She snatched it up. A message? At 3:15? Her fingers fumbled to open it. It was a photo. Her breath hitched. The photo showed her lying in her futon, her face pale with fear. A hand was resting on her shoulder. She spun around, but no one was there. The next day, she went to the temple and spoke to the priest. Her face darkened as she described the sketchbook in the man's voice. His work is unfinished, the priest said. He's looking for someone to finish it. He gave her a charm, a small pouch of rice and salt, and told her to place it above her door. She did as she was told. For a few nights, the house was still, and she slept. But on the fifth night, the scratching returned. Not at the wall this time, at the door. Her phone buzzed. Another photo. Her thumb hovered over it, her breath shallow. She didn't want to look, but she had to. The photo was of her door. The hallway was dark, but something pale peeked out from behind the frame. A face, tilted, smiling. Her phone buzzed again. Another photo. This time it was closer. Her phone buzzed. The face was at the door now. It was looking in. It was inside the room. It was right behind her. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned her phone's camera to selfie mode, the screen illuminating her face in a pale blue light. Behind her, leaning over her shoulder, was the man from the sketchbook, smiling. Do you see me? He asked, his voice right against her ear. The phone fell from her hands, and she did. She saw him. The Wrong Mother. Kaito hated the walk home from school. The path cut through a narrow stretch of forest, winding up a hill where the trees pressed close together like spectators. His small feet crunched over the dirt path, and every step echoed louder than it should have. The forest always felt like it was watching him. Don't look back, his mother had once told him. Her voice was gentle but firm. No matter what you hear, don't turn around. He hadn't asked why. He didn't have to. There were some rules he just followed. It was autumn now, and the brittle orange leaves crunched underfoot. The air smelled of cold dirt and something faintly sour, like fruit left too long in the sun. Kaito walked quickly, his small hands shoved into his coat pockets. He could see the roof of his house peeking out just beyond the hill's peak. Almost there. A snap echoed behind him. Kaito's heart jolted. He didn't turn around. It was probably a branch, a falling acorn. maybe a bird. Don't look back. The house came into view at the top of the hill, a small old wooden structure that leaned ever so slightly to the right. The windows were shut and the front door was closed. He could see the glow of the kitchen light inside. His mother was home. His pace quickened. Another snap behind him. This time it was closer. He stopped. His breath hung in the air, white and thin like spider silk. Slowly, he glanced to the side, trying to see without turning his head. Nothing. Just trees. Kaito squeezed his hands into fists and bolted for the house. He didn't stop running until he reached the front door, his small hands gripping the cold metal handle. He swung it open and stepped aside, heart pounding, his face flushed with cold. The familiar smell of miso soup and steamed rice filled the house. Warm. Safe. Welcome home, his mother called from the kitchen. Her voice was soft and kind, just like it always was. Kaito kicked off his shoes and hung his bag by the door. She was standing at the counter, her back to him. Her long black hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her sleeves rolled up as she chopped vegetables. Her movements were slow, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Kaito's heart slowly settled. Something wrong? She asked, not turning around. He hesitated. Should I tell her? He thought about the snaps in the wood, the sound of something following him. No, he muttered, shaking his head. It's nothing. His mother didn't respond. Her chopping continued. He watched for her for a moment longer. Her shoulders were stiff, tighter than usual. Go wash your hands, she said. Her voice was calm, normal, but something felt wrong. Dinner was quiet. Kaito sat cross-legged on the tatami mat, his bowl of rice steaming in front of him. His mother sat across from him, but she wasn't eating. She was watching him. Her eyes were sharp tonight. Too sharp. Eat, she said softly. He lifted a piece of eggplant to his mouth, chewing slowly. Her gaze didn't waver. Usually she'd be telling him stories about her day or asking about school, but tonight she was quiet. Did something happen at school? She asked suddenly. Her eyes didn't blink. Kaito swallowed too quickly and coughed. His mother didn't move. No, he croaked. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just a bit. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Kaito gripped his chopsticks tighter. He looked down at his bowl, eating slowly, quietly. The air felt heavier than usual. His mother's gaze bore into him, watching every movement like she was waiting for him to slip up. Why is she staring at me like that? Mom, he said quietly, not looking up. Did you go out today? Her smile twitched. No, she replied. Her voice was soft, slow, like she was carefully measuring every syllable. I've been here all day. Why do you ask? Kaito hesitated, his fingers pressed harder into his chopsticks. I thought I saw someone on the hill. Her smile widened. Did you? The only sound was the faint tick-tick-tick of the kitchen clock. Kaito woke up to the sound of footsteps. Soft, barefoot. They moved slowly across the hallway, right outside his door. Mom? He sat up in bed, his small fingers gripping his blanket. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then slowly his door creaked open. The hallway beyond was pitch black. His mother stood in the doorway. Her face was hidden in the shadow, but he could see the faint outline of her figure. She was still. Too still. Her head tilted to the side, slow and deliberate, like a puppet on a string. Are you awake? She asked, her voice soft as silk. Kaito didn't answer. His body locked up, his breath shallow. Go back to sleep, Kaito, she said. Her head tilted back to the center, but her body didn't move. Then she stepped backward into the hall. The door closed on its own. The next day, Kaito didn't want to go to school. Why are you stalling? His mother asked as she tied his scarf around his neck. Her smile was there again, too wide and too sharp. No reason, he mumbled. She crouched down, gripping his shoulders firmly, her nails pressed into his coat. Don't be late coming home, she said, her face too close to his. And don't look back. Kaito nodded quickly, heart thudding. She stayed crouched, staring at him like she was waiting for him to say something else. When he didn't, she let him go. The forest felt different that day. The air was colder, the ground softer, like he was walking on something hollow. Don't look back. Don't look back. Halfway up the hill, the crunch of leaves came from behind him. His heart jumped. Snap, crunch. His feet froze. The sound wasn't far, it's close. Another step right behind him. Tears welled in his eyes. He squeezed them shut. Kaito. His heart stopped. It was his mother's voice, but it wasn't coming from the house. It was right behind him. Kaito, she said, her voice gentle, sweet, like she was calling him in for dinner. Don't look back. Kaito, why aren't you answering me? She asked, her voice just behind his ear now. His breathing grew rapid. Tears streamed down his face. Come on, Kaito, she whispered. Look at me. His feet started moving. He didn't turn. He ran. His backpack jostled against his back as his legs pumped faster than they ever had before. Look at me, Kaito. Her voice was closer. She's chasing me. The house appeared at the top of the hill. He didn't stop running. His feet hit the porch hard. He yanked the front door open and slammed it behind him, locking it tight. His breath was ragged, his cheeks wet with tears. Honey? His mother called from the kitchen. Her eyes locked onto him. Her soft smile returned. Did something happen at school? Kaito didn't speak. His eyes flicked to the window. A figure was standing there, a woman with black hair. Her head tilted slowly to one side. His mother crouched down, hands on his shoulders. Don't look at her, she said softly. Her nails dug into his coat. Her smile widened.